Let me tell you the story of the emergence and development of Silicon Valley. If we look back more than 100 years, California did not look like a technologically advanced region. Quite the opposite. It was an agricultural region known for its orchards and plantations. And so, it happened historically that at that time, all the U.S. industry was located in the northeastern regions of the USA. Therefore, it was quite logical to assume that these northern regions would become the flagships of technological development. So why California? Today, it is believed that Stanford played a key role in the development of Silicon Valley, and that's absolutely true. However, Stanford's role is only part of the puzzle. The other part is military orders. If we talk about the role of Stanford, it is not only a source of talent, but also a fairly large contribution to the development of the Valley was made by employees of the educational institution. One of these was Stanford professor Frederick Terman, who is considered the founding father of Silicon Valley. And he really did a lot to turn California into a high-tech region. If he saw an interesting idea, he helped students bring it to life. He helped with finding financing and even invested himself. And here we can recall the history of the Hewlett-Packard company, from which Silicon Valley itself was born. Now, near the garage where the founders started working, there is a memorial plaque, Birthplace of Silicon Valley. So, when William Hewlett and David Packard presented the idea of developing an audio generator in their thesis, it was Terman who convinced them that this idea had a practical application and could be commercialized. The product really turned out to be successful, and the newly created company even managed to sign a small contract with the Walt Disney Studio. But it was 1939, and the company achieved real success when it started working on military contracts. The company's website even has a separate story on this topic. One of the largest government contracts was the development of electronic warfare equipment under the code name Leopard. The company developed an entire system, starting from antennas and ending with oscillators, which helped warships counteract enemy radio direction finding equipment. This system interrupted signals about the location of the ship and created the impression that it was in another place. And it was thanks to military contracts that the company's sales increased from $5,000 in 1939 to about $2 million by the end of the war. By the way, after the war, cooperation with the government did not end, and the company continued to work on military contracts. If we return to the role of Terman, then during the Second World War he was invited to head a secret government organization, the Harvard Radio Research Laboratory. It was there that Terman saw the abyss separating universities and companies in the east of the country from companies in the west. So after the war, he returned to Stanford and took up the position of dean, determined to reverse this trend. Since he had made connections in Washington while working on research projects, upon his return, he decided to use these connections to attract funding and government contracts for both Stanford itself and local companies. First, he founded the Stanford Research Institute, which attracted funding for research and development for defense sector. He also actively developed cooperation with local companies, engaging in joint developments and training of specialists. And even later, given that the university had a lot of land that was not being used at all, he initiated the creation of the Stanford Industrial Park. And already in 1961, the park had 25 residents. Among the famous residents is the Lockheed Company, which, thanks to Terman's efforts, opened a research laboratory. However, despite some successes, the rapid development of the Santa Clara Valley was still ahead. And this development is associated with an industry that did not yet exist before 1951, namely with the development of silicon semiconductors, thanks to which Silicon Valley got its name. It all started when William Shockley, a Stanford graduate and the inventor of the transistor, decided to monetize his invention and founded the Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory. Given that Shockley's mother was often ill and needed care, he decided to create a company near his mother's house in Palo Alto. And this chance event in choosing a location determined the fate of the industry for decades to come. Shockley invited young, promising engineers to his team. And although he was a good developer, he turned out to be a very bad manager. And because of constant conflicts in the company, a group of 8 employees decided to leave Shockley to found their own company, Fairchild Semiconductor. Later, this group would be called the Traitorous 8. Fairchild focused its efforts on research into silicon-based semiconductors. At that time, it was a rather unpopular direction because the market was dominated by semiconductors based on the material germanium. But the guys quickly proved that silicon was better. And in fact, their work was the beginning of the silicon revolution in the production of semiconductors. Later, the company received its first contracts for silicon chips from the Ministry of Defense. Initially, these chips were used in strategic bombers and later in ballistic missiles. Although these contracts were small, they allowed the young company to stay afloat. However, the real development of the company began after one event. In 1957, the USSR launched its first satellite into space. Since this was a direct threat to the technological dominance of the United States in the world, President Eisenhower gave the order to create organizations such as NASA and DARPA to catch up and overtake in the upcoming space race. It was a completely non-commercial and very unprofitable project, but it was on it that the image of the United States as the most innovative state depended. Therefore, the US government was ready to spend any money just to prove its superiority. For companies such as Fairchild Semiconductor, such a decision at the state level was a unique opportunity for future development, which they took advantage of. In 1958, the company developed an integrated circuit, and soon NASA became the main customer of these circuits for its space programs. And large government contracts allowed the company to invest in expanding production and become a market leader. In 1964 alone, the company produced 100,000 integrated circuits for the Apollo program. Over time, such a high dependence on government contracts later became the cause of the company's problems. The company overestimated the possible demand among private business and invested a lot of credit funds in expanding production. Over time, it turned out that orders in the private sector were not enough, and the company began to have problems servicing loans. Also, its leading specialists began to leave the company. In 1968, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, who later founded Intel, left the company. In 1969, Jerry Sanders left, who decided to found AMD. Many more specialists were lured away by other companies, and all these specialists will even start jokingly calling them Fairchildren. And although the company itself was not successful, it became an incubator for many Silicon Valley companies.